Welcome to Velocity Philosophy. This episode, we talked to Elliott Richardson from Acadia University, strength and conditioning coach, coaching across all varsity teams. And what's interesting about what Elliott does is he coaches in a small school environment. And for me, that means a really interesting discussion about, on the one hand, needing a coach to really understand what they're talking about, what they're doing, and nailing the fundamentals of VBT, and then being able to address limitations and barriers of the small school environment, which can include budget, number of students that need to be worked with, balancing sports performance against academic performance, and how Elliott particularly gets really creative and adaptable using the versatility that GymAware offers to solve a lot of those problems. So I took a lot from this chat with Elliott. What about you, Jay?
Yeah, like you said, small school. What I think is really interesting, and it's starting to almost become a common theme, is that GymAware is a sort of, bang for your buck purchase, a one-stop shop, if you will. But yeah, it's really interesting just to hear how he's using it for a variety of things. Like he's using it for jump testing before the guys, start training. He's using it in training for the instant feedback. All the sets and reps are being tracked, so he's actually trending things over time. So yeah, definitely very interesting one this week. So ready to get into it, Will?
Sure am. Thanks for doing this with us, Elliott. I'm really looking forward to the presentation. So we've just had a really quick sneak peek across the different slides, and something I'm already really interested in, and I find exciting to talk to coaches of student athletes is you're sort of forced by certain limitations. Sometimes it's budgetary, sometimes it's space, sometimes it's the number of students you've got or your coaching assistant staff to get creative. And I really like how what we find is that coaches at this age group really nail the fundamentals and then can get creative or flexible or adaptive with application of VBT. So I won't over talk it. Just wanted to lead into the preso there, and I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thanks Will. Thanks Jay. So this is something that's passionate to me. I've followed quite a few of the presentations of people that have talked about, how they're implementing VBT in their scenario. And, there's professional organizations, large Division I schools. So schools in places with a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of financial backing to be able to help them up. And, I just wanted to add a piece to the conversation about, how this can be done in a smaller scale. And as long as you have a system, which I'll touch base on, is that you can really implement a breadth of tools, and also some pretty good depth as long as you have it set up properly. So just talk about applying VBT in a small school setting. Bit about myself. My name's Elliott Richardson. I'm the head strength and conditioning coach at Acadia University and also manage our integrated support team. I'm our school's first full-time strength coach. If you look in the top left, I also played Canadian football, which is a version of American football, and had the good fortune through strength and conditioning really to be able to move on to play professionally in the CFL for 3 years. And as with most professional athletes, eventually that time comes to an end, and went back to Acadia and started volunteering as a strength and conditioning coach, and was fortunate to be able to fall into a full-time role early on and start be able to work with our student athletes. And early in my career, I remember going to 2014 coaches conference and sitting in on, I was just passing by and saw a presentation going on by Brian Mann, and didn't know who he was at the time, but I remember him telling a story about Tool was using Nintendo at the time, and the problem he had in terms of his athletes not, they were technically thinking they were training for power and explosive power, but when it came down to the results, they didn't see any transfer, they didn't see any improvement. When he went back to a VBT type of training mentality and started implementing, they saw drastic improvement in the results. That really stuck with me. And fortunately, when I went back, we had one Tendo in our kinesiology department and started playing around with that. And eventually that led down to some other devices. And as I started my master's at St. Mary's in London, England, Dan Baker was one of our summer on-site guest lecturers. And He delivered some great talks on how he implements VBT, which put me to the next level, and taught me some new ways of implementing it and a better understanding of some of the metrics and the ways you can influence athlete performance. And I'll talk a bit about how GymAware fits in with that and where it came to along, because when I first came in, at Acadia University, this is our original weight room. So we had carpet, if you can see, carpet on the weight room floor. We had 2 squat racks, a couple benches, and this is back in 2011. 10 teams, and this is what attracted me to go to Acadia, was the opportunity to work with 300 athletes and gain a ton of experience. I always said I could gain 10 years of experience and 5 years of coaching, and minimal interns, so it was pretty much just me. And then on top of that, we had to run private training to support our budget, so we had local athletes training with us as well too. So fast forward, probably 7 or 8 years, and through fundraising, and in particular, one former football player who had deep pockets, an engineer, and he had seen us use Tendo before and seen us use some other VBT and liked the idea of it, and he decided he was going to invest a large portion, make sure we had the best devices possible, because he understood that the way strength and conditioning was going, it wasn't just about how much weight you could lift on a bar. It was also about the amount of power that you're producing, minimizing fatigue, and at the end of the day, improving performance with the lowest rate of injury possible. Those are the teams that are going to win. So, we upgraded. We got a significantly nicer space. Still couldn't fit a lot of teams in there, maybe about 25 athletes or so. Our internship did grow, but at the same time, we didn't have an extensive sports science budget to get some of these other products that some of these other speakers have talked about. So we needed something that could provide a lot of solutions, be easy to use, and also be able to deliver during a training session as well too. So GymAware for me was just an easy choice in terms of what we were going to buy with the money we had allotted to us. Where this goes and how I want to frame my story in terms of how we use GymAware in our situation, our small school, is our previous year, our 2019 season of our football team, and we've had a strong history of success. Myself, I won 2 championships there as an athlete, and my first few years, we had another couple championships, and so strong history. But we've never had an undefeated season. But this past year, not only were we undefeated in conference play, we won the conference championship, moved on to national championship series. And probably one of the things I want to highlight is we only had 1 starter miss a game due to injury that year. So in addition to some of the changes we made in our off-season programming, we really wanted to make sure that our guys were the freshest possible, but also perform at the highest level. The previous year, it was one of our first years in the weight room, so I didn't have the systems in place to be able to fully execute using GymAware in a comprehensive setting outside of just jump monitoring, which I'll touch base in a second. But this year, in terms of our planning and developing really solid systems, we're able to pretty much use it as an entire system. So in terms of how we used it, we tried to use it for as much as we could. So we wanted to capture where our athletes were from a fatigue perspective, because talking with coaches and previous coaches, one thing they would generally say is they're just concerned that some of the strength and conditioning we might be doing during the season would make them tired. And we have to remember that in terms of the school we're at, we're not a supremely funded organization. Our student athletes are really, really good students as well. We happen to have the highest academic All-Canadians per capita in the country. Are on a 4-point scale for 4-point scale for football. Our average GPA for football is over 3.0. So we have a lot of academically minded students that put in a lot of long hours in the library. And then there's, we don't have blocked practice or blocked classes for our student athletes. So some of them have, they have school from 8 until 4 almost every day. Our idea of a training table for snacks might be where we can afford to give them maybe 1 scoop of protein. So, we don't have the recovery modalities a lot of schools have. We don't have the availability of time that other places have. So we really have to make sure that we're not overstimulating them in terms of their training, but at the same time, making sure that we're giving them enough dose that when it comes to the end of our 16-week season, we're as good or better than we were at the start. Because otherwise, if we're just going to go through the motions, then we may as well just completely dial back the training.
So
That's what some schools have done.
So I was just wondering then, and you might have said this and I could have missed it, but are those points, so is like fatigue monitoring almost the first way you seek to use it? Is there a bit of a priority to these points and in that sense?
Yeah, it's almost just how we go through the session and in terms of how we go through the season. So that's our first thing we'll do every single day. Is we'll use jumps, and I'll talk about that a bit on the next slide. We'll use a couple different types of jumps to look at fatigue monitoring and where we are and how we're going to adjust the session, either if we're going to scale it down or bump it back up, but to also show the athletes that their performance is holding over the course of the season as well. So I don't like to waste time testing because I have very little time with our athletes. So if we can bake that into their training, then I know that we're going to get consistent, we'll be able to consistently see where they are. And then, during this year, at least we tried to use a variety of different options that you can measure through VBT system. And then at the end, I'll talk a bit about how we developed a system around it, because I think that if you're just using it to show some data, or if you're just using it for the sake of using it, you can't action it. And if you don't have a good system in place, you'll run into challenges in terms of actually being able to use the data. So for us, we use, the first thing we do at the end of their warm-up is, we do, like most coaches, a ramp style warm-up. So when they get to that potentiate piece, that's going to be our jumps. And we'll do a series of, in the off season, or sorry, the in season this year, we did 3 counter movement jumps, and we would look at their set average. And there's a good paper, can't remember the name of it, but talked about, it's presented on at this NSCA conference recently, talked about there's normal variation of 1 to 6% in terms of daily fluctuation and readiness from jump perspective. So for us, we would use a 10% cutoff during the regular season. If we did have some tough weeks, or if we got to championship time, or if we had some really strong competition, we might dial it down to 5%. And we would look at their set average. So the nice thing about GymAware is we're able to show them on the iPad, where their personal best was, and then we would be able to, over the course of their 3 jumps, see where they are and be able to make some decisions off of that. So one thing which I highly recommend all the coaches to do, especially if you're in a smaller setting like us, because for us it wouldn't have been able to be implemented if we didn't do it, was we spent probably half an hour during training camp, when we weren't doing too much training anyway, to actually teach the athletes how to use the system. Yeah. So for us, we came to the decision this year that I want my athletes to be at the same level of education and knowledge about our training as one of our introductory interns. So if our interns who are undergrads go through their first year, our athletes should all have that base level of understanding. So because one hurdle we thought of when we're going to implement fully integrated system, obviously there are time constraints. We want to keep our lifts to 35 minutes. Is we didn't have the time from a staff resource perspective for us all to be at every single rack and be able to execute this. We didn't want to take away from the student athlete or take away from training. So, took maybe a session. The first session they actually did was a bit rough, but after that it was smooth sailing for the entire season. And
so that was a half an hour formal or semi-formal education component. That seems like a small time investment, really.
There was, we had our volleyball team, their coach was adamant the year before that they get a session, and that we just saw such tremendous benefit from that we rolled it out to all our teams. And for football specifically, during training camp, they had some pockets of time where we could bring them in where they really weren't going to be doing training anyway. So we were able to get that out of the way and use it as an orientation. And now we have it for all those athletes for the next 3 years through their career. We'll understand how to use it, and now all it will take will be one introductory session for our incoming players. And then in terms of what we did for making decisions, we always perform subjective wellness as well over the course of their days. So we would try and match that data up, and then we would just make decisions. If someone was under that 10% threshold, we would likely reduce some of the volume. First thing we would do is drop sets, and then if there was significant fatigue, we would drop sets and intensity, but they would still have to do something. We'd never really let athletes, unless they're totally fried, miss a session. And usually that almost comes beforehand. Like we'll see their wellness report come in, and I might see I remember seeing one of our running backs just 1s out of 5s almost across the board, and just shot him a message on Slack and say, hey, don't bother coming in today. But if you're reasonably in tuned and come in and show a bit of a deficit, it'll just be a quick little mention. Will be that conversation and give them some options. At the end of the day, some of the athletes decide not to take it. They decide just to do the regular work, and that's fine. Because after a set they might feel better, and then because we auto-regulate during the season anyway, by prescribing velocities over loads, it ends up taking care of itself anyway. But the big thing is just, hey, and I'll talk about this in a second, in terms of just dropping some of our volume first, and then some of our intensities if we really have to. One thing we do, we do Olympic lift quite a bit with our athletes, especially off season. It doesn't get great feedback in season, and not a big fan of the risk reward benefit in the season. So in the past few years, we've used a lot of Olympic lift variations, whether it's hang shrugs, hang pulls, jump shrugs, even some trap bar jumps. The one thing I've struggled with as a coach is, even if I've given them a percentage, is just getting a good objective rep on it, because they always feel that they can do more, or they don't feel they're achieving something, because they just it's, at least with a clean, it's a very clear constraint in terms of whether you successfully caught it or not, and it's very muddy when you're doing a clean variation. So some of them always want to go up weight. Some of them, they don't understand maybe how to apply as much effort as they like. So what we would do is we would give them a target. We would give a squad target for the entire group on their Olympic lift variations, and have that set the tone. And for a lot of them, they want to go heavy. So, and this was with everything we did in terms of VBTs, I would tell them, you can go as heavy as you want today, as long as you hit that score. You can't go any lighter. So that gives them a bit of control in terms of, they can feel like they're going the heaviest they can, but just that small constraint or rule that it just has to be at that bandwidth. And then we can determine successful rep from a non-successful rep without having to actually catch the lift. And we would do that for trap bar jumps as well. It's something that I implemented this off season as well, for guys that can't clean due to orthopedic restrictions. We would put a velocity constriction or velocity target on them, and we would periodize that over the course of it. So this is what it would look like. We would use, I found average, even though a lot of people suggest using peak velocities for Olympic lifts, I found it a bit more stable with mean velocities, though I would use peak velocities as a backup. So what we would really do is, we would just, each week, we would just drop the velocity a little bit, so we'd get that percentage and increase. Because what I've seen with Dan Baker's work is that he suggests 0.08 to 0.09, which if you round up is 0.1, equates to about 5%. So what we were getting essentially is a 5% increase in load every week. And then if you reference Prilipin's chart, finding some sets that match up with that. And then over the course of what we would do is just a challenge. If we didn't vary the weight or vary the exercise, the following phase, we'd go back and repeat the process, and their goal was to try and exceed what they did the previous phase. So it added a little bit of competition against themselves as well too. It just allowed a way to just break up the monotony of training as well, as opposed to just doing the same exercise every week and not knowing if they're improving. We can set a firm target with them from a speed strength perspective. This would usually be our game day -2 or game day -3 block, because we do the squats and bench usually earlier in the week. But it would just give them an objective way of seeing if they're improving. And again, add another coach, because for myself, I would be the only full-time paid coach in the room, and I might have 1 to 2 interns helping me out. So GymAware acted as another coach, just to be able to gauge effort and keep people in check. From yep.
Sorry, was that table, is that exercise specific really? Or
yeah, that would be what we would use right for our clean pull. Yeah, so it'd be our A1 exercise on day 2 for our 3 phase, and we would just roll that through each repeating phase.
Yep.
And then it doesn't show it here, but I'll talk about in that week 4, which is usually a bye week for us, we would work up to 1 meter per second at mean velocity, and that would be considered their PB. We found that really stable in terms of a failure point. Once they dip under 1 meter per second mean velocity on an Olympic lift, usually around 2 meters per second peak, that's where we'd start to see people failing. So we could use that as almost a way of checking out 1 rep maxes without actually having to do it.
Yeah. And what happens when they go below that 1 meter per second? You cut off.
They don't hear the ding. They don't hear the ding, and usually they get chastised by their teammates. So it was good. Like, I'll talk about. I wish I had some. If I had more time, would have put some videos in there. But what I really learned really quickly with the augmented feedback that you get with the system is that we were able to get in-season training in terms of volumes and loads and intensities, but with an off-season type of energy and intensity. Because all of a sudden when you set that target for them and they hit it and they get that ding, then it's a bit of a celebration. And guys get pretty fired up about it, and they know when their numbers are going up. And it was just, it was immediate right away. As soon as we gave them targets and they hit it, the energy picked up right away. So because they got that feedback right away, they knew it was a good rep, as opposed to before, traditional, again, probably like rugby players, football players, like they only gauge their improvement by weight on the bar. It's not always the most important thing. And we know that, again, if you're training at a higher, especially for us, if they're training too heavy, they're going to get a little bit more fatigued. And, a lot of this is just based on, intent. We want to drive intent, because if you look at, some of the, Bame's work in 84, and if you can get, maximal intent, then you're going to recruit those higher motor unit fibers and be able to get, those fast twitch fibers going without having to really go to the bank in terms of really tapping them out. So, it was interesting in season, really early during the, we had a bye week and we implemented this, and I wanted to see, I wanted to just have some information in case our coach was subjectively saying, hey, I think our guys are a little bit sore and fatigued from this workout, and it shows the next day. So one of the first things I did after implementing our VBT and being able to check it is I went back to our wellness reports, and we actually saw an improvement in their soreness the day after their first lift, in terms of their feedback. So I knew, right away that I didn't, that as a group anyway, by doing this, almost acted a little bit as a recovery, but we definitely didn't tap into them too much to create any soreness or fatigue the following day. Lower body is always a challenge in terms of training, especially some of these twitchier athletes in season. And again, I don't like the idea of just going through the motions where they're just, casually going up and down and want to get through it. So, giving them a target other than weight was really good. And we had some really, really positive results. Again, just talked about it, having that off-season type of feel and really good effort from the guys. And instead of worrying about weight on the sheet, because we always had if you give someone 50% of their max and you ask them to go up and down with it, they can, as long as they go up and down, they can tell you they did it. Yeah. But by putting a different parameter or rule, which is at this speed, you're driving that intent at the same time. For those that want to work a little bit harder, you're giving another rule or constraint that you can go as heavy as you want as long as you hit these parameters. And we had I'll talk about this a bit more, like for our strength speed, we had a wider range of sets and reps, and especially on the set side, like we understand that some of our players are at different levels, from starters to dressers and non-dressers. I'll talk about that towards the end, but essentially what we did is the same thing, and all the mean velocities knocked off 0.05 meters per second every week. And the next phase, we knocked off a little bit of volume, knocked it down to 2 reps. And then as we got into, so phase 3 for us was really into playoffs and championships, is we just wanted a really minimal dose, and then give the guys the option. If they got that 1 rep and they hit it and didn't want to go, they didn't have to do a second one, which a lot of our starters chose, and some of our dressers decided to keep going. So in terms of what that looked like this is our data from our year looking at power, and we're able to see that we pretty much stayed within. We had some peaks. There's an outlier there early in the season, and that's just that we had one small group that had a small subsection of guys. But as we got towards the end, we have that second. This is where our starters were right before the championships. We had a nice little peak there, and I think actually we're at about wasn't much. It was like between 2 and 5% increase in power from a lower body perspective over the course of the year. But we're able to show the guys at their bye weeks, hey, look, we're as good, if not better, than we were at the start. So let's keep doing and increase the buy-in with the program, because the athletes were seeing the success, and it matched up well with some of our wellness data.
So, just to go back to the set and rep scheme for the lower body, is that entirely up to the athlete with the rating?
No, not so much. That was up to us. So if we had, our starters could just do 3 or 4 sets if they wanted.
Yeah.
And then if you were a dresser, but if you played less than probably 30, usually most in a football game, you might get upwards of 90 snaps. If you were below that 30, if you were around that 30 snap threshold, you would do usually the full 6 sets. And then what we did on top of that, because we had players that we still needed to develop that weren't playing at all, is we would just instead of doing 3 reps, they would just go until they dropped below that 0.85 or whatever the velocity threshold was. That so again, they wanted to get some more work out of themselves, but again, it was controlling that fatigue as well too, because we know from some of the Spanish research that as soon as you get too much of a fatigue loss, then that's when you start getting those soreness markers the next day. So we wanted to give them a little bit more control. We knew they were motivated to try and improve themselves, so we left them with some open-ended sets. Be like, hey, hit as many good reps as you can. If you end up hitting 8 or 10 or 12, then we'll adjust the speed for you as well. So, but for most of them, we had 3 levels. We had a group that, probably just doing 3 sets. Those were our players that had a high amount of workload anyway off the field or on the field. And then we had our medium workload group, then our low workload group, and it allowed us to be flexible within our programming, because we already have a program for our rookies. We have a program that is geared towards our 3 different position groups that we classify our guys as. So if we then had to come up with another permutation for dressers, non-dressers, and starters, that would just create too much work. So we wanted to make sure our systems were flexible enough that and adaptable that we could get the most out of each guys with minimal back end work. And then in terms of our upper body, again, I might do it a little bit differently if it wasn't a football athlete or a rugby athlete. But we liked being a little bit of football and rugby players tend to want to lift upper body a little bit more. So we wanted to keep them out of the absolute strength zone. But we know that they wanted to push themselves. And then if you, again, look at the qualities of accelerative strength, it's moving a sub-maximal load or with a bit of speed. And that is, I know that Brian Mann's looked into some of the research and some of the blocking, blocking maneuvers or shedding blocks comes in that same zone. So again, specific to football as well. And we used similar strategy for there. And again, guys that wanted to do more, we just left it open to them. Hey, you can have an open-ended set. You can do as many good reps as you'd like, as long as you hit these parameters. And especially for our linemen that might have a lot of upper body collisions in them, they might be on that lower threshold of just 3 sets. And but again, giving that flexibility to them as well. And again, same thing. We might have a group just based off our constraints of a small school. I can't have all my starters in one group. I'm going to have a mix. Even within one rack, might be a starter, a backup, and a non-dresser. So I want to make sure that my workflow is the same regardless of group. So by having this built in and giving them some flexibility, also gives them some increased autonomy as well too. And then again, what we saw, we started just below 600 meters or 600 watts as our best set. I think towards championship week we ended up at 633. So not massive, but still an improvement towards the end of the year. And you can see again these low points were some of our going into bye weeks or when we might have been a little bit more fatigued during midterm period. Absolute strength, we would fortunately we had some bye weeks, so we used that, and there's a great way of one, getting them to be able to touch 80%, and then also be able to link back to their projected 1 rep max with what we had in their off season as well too. So other thing I like about it is with the protocol given through GymAware is just it's super low fatigue. They might only hit 1 rep over 80%. So it keeps a lot of those fatigue markers down. And this is an example, just how we did it through with bench press. You can see the athlete again around a 275 pound squat, or sorry, bench press, where their load at max power is. So we show the athletes that, and then where their projected failure point was. So we would reference that against, that'd be another piece of data that we would give the athletes their bye week, so they could see that what they're doing was transferring. And one of the ways we sold it too is in the off season we might be training more maximum strength, but in season power is a more important quality to be working for, and that really helped. So in terms of, again, adapting through a system, really it was just those three groups, adjusting the volume, and then giving some guys open sets, and then setting targets. Setting targets for them was a massive feature that we had. So I'll stop sharing that. But yeah, that's just, again, and even in a small school, we were able to get a lot of data. We were able to get some really good feedback. We kept fatigue super low with, the majority of our athletes. And, we did have a very skilled team. That obviously helps. But when you do something that no team in your school's history has done for football anyway, which is go undefeated, in addition to only have one starter miss a game due to injury, there's certainly some positive that has to be coming from some of the tools we implemented from a VBT perspective.
Wow. Okay. With measuring and monitoring, do you use any other tools? Like, I know GymAware's the feature of the presentation, but do you have any other anything that you back up the GymAware data with? I know some coaches like to do 2, sometimes 3 fatigue monitoring tests, for example.
No, it's just not practical. We would do, we had an athlete management system that would bring in wellness and workload data. So we would match that up a little bit against that. And we would run reports before every workout group came in and see who might be a candidate for having to adjust load. And, but we have a jump mat as well too, but we only have one. So, we have 6 GymAwares. For us, it's, GymAware can do the same things as, whether it's just a contact mat, but it can also do the other things as well too. And it can store the data, because I don't have time to write everything down, then go input it and see what that was compared to their personal best. For me, it just pops right up on the screen. The athlete gets that feedback, and they became more educated to the point that they understood where they stood on that day, and they started questioning me like, "Hey, why? What have I? I've been doing this, or what can contribute to this?" So we have some other tools, but it's a comprehensive tool, and it does more than does a combination of other things.
Yeah, I always wonder that too, like the necessity of. Everyone needs to coach their own way. So I don't mean to cast any judgments on how people coach, but you've got a lot coming with the numbers. Like velocity tells you a lot, and you also mentioned you auto-regulate. So you don't just do a jump test. You don't just take the AMS information. You watch during the season how they're going. So as much as they're still prescribed into groups, you can see how they're performing, literally lift by lift.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, if I just took their jump data, I may not be able to action it, and especially right away. And that's the most important thing. And for me, that's fast sports science. Be able to take something, instantaneously make a decision or pivot. And then I also want that slow sports science, which again is going back onto the cloud and running that report, whether it's at the end of the week or end of the phase, and seeing where we are. And that gives me the information again to increase buy-in, because I have that objective data that shows that what we're prescribing is working, and the situations where it's not allows us to pivot. And a lot of the protocols that we ended up on were because things we'd done before didn't work, or we weren't able to give that feedback. I know there's just another study out the last couple of years, but just about if you aren't giving the athletes back that information they're providing, either through a wellness questionnaire, it could be even simple as a jump. If they don't understand what that data means or what it does, they're less likely to give you a good effort or less likely to be bought into it. So by giving those feedback reports, we would throw them onto our Slack channel and share them with the coaches as well too, and give them a snapshot of this is where we are. And they, one, know it's being used, and two, can see the tangible improvements as well.
Yeah, just circling back to some of the tech, like I know you've had experience with GymAware, obviously, and you said you borrowed a Tendo unit from an Easyology lab. Have there been any other pieces of tech that you've sort of dabbled with, and why is GymAware, I guess, for you? Is there a reason why GymAware is so valuable?
Yeah, I think so. One of my former assistants, he went to another school and he bought quite a few Tendos from it fit well for his budget. He needed multiple units. For me, I really like Tendo when I used it because it gave you that objective, instantaneous feedback, but it didn't store anything. I've used Push as well too. Which does have a cloud-based service, but again, I also need workflow as well. I only have one coach, maybe a couple interns in a group. So one big feature that I really like about GymAware is just the auto start, auto finish feature, where the athletes don't really have to, once they get it set up, they're good to go. It automatically starts, it automatically finishes. They don't have to think about it, which also increases the quality of the data. So, because I've had the experiences where the athlete doesn't put in the right weight, and then all of a sudden their power outputs are all over the place. So you have to go in the back end and you have to delete stuff. And I've had, athletes lifting on different profiles because it didn't switch for them because they didn't press stop. Again, a little bit that was education. One thing we taught them in our education sessions, this is how you select, who's in your rack. So that's the first thing they do while everyone else warms up. Another best practice we learned this year is again, I don't want to put too much more cognitive demand on my athletes when they come into the training session, is we made a rule that, hey, we're only going to measure and monitor working sets. So if you have to hit warm-up sets, don't waste the time entering the weights. Don't worry about that. Use the time, and that actually created an increased efficiency. Actually, was they had their warm-up period of their warm-up sets to get everything set up. They knew approximately what they're going to lift that day, so they had 6 to 7 minutes to get their names set up, what weights they're going to hit. They knew how to readjust their order. And so it increased their workflow once they got into it, because they would still have, pairs of exercise they had to do. Now they could just hit auto record. They could go through it, boom, boom, boom. Data was captured, quite accurately. And, they minimized the workload, because that's another feedback we had from our athletes. They don't like having to think too much. They want this thing to help them. They don't want to take away from their training session by having to perform mental exercise on top of physical exercise. So it's set and go. Once you're good to go and you've educated them, and that auto record feature was something that is probably not spoken enough about in terms of its value, especially if you're working in a setting where you can't have maybe one coach in every rack. And as well, like my interns, I don't want them to I want them to learn how to coach. I don't want them just being the person that stands and presses start and stop on the iPad as well. So I think when it came down to, then you think about, okay, what's the cost going to be if I'm going to be able to integrate 2 or 3 different pieces of technology, like a contact mat and something else, and a feedback device for their liftings, and a cloud storage device. It's GymAware brings the big ones all under one roof. So it was just a one-stop shop, so to speak.
Yeah.
Just curious, how many athletes would you have training in a rack, and in the room as well?
Usually 3 to 4 on a rack. Or 3 to 4 on a station at the same time. And in the off season might be a little bit more, like with our rugby team, they'd be maybe 30 something. And we would just use our GymAware for our veteran players in that regard, and they would get priority over it. And we might have it set up that we have 3 racks associated with bench, 3 associated with squat, and then 3 platforms going. So we might have people on the racks and on the floor. Like, again, rookies, generally we don't use VBT with our rookies except for jump monitoring, because they're on a very just foundational program. And usually most of them don't start anyway. And we just want to make sure that our starters are the ones that are we're putting the most priority, especially in the in-season period, on them.
Yeah. Jay,
No, he's literally answered all my questions.
Yeah, I think we can probably look at wrapping it up. We could talk about this all day.
Yeah.
You covered a lot of the questions during the presentation, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
One of my ones which you answered was educating athletes. To what extent? And that was pretty concise. And I think a really good answer, actually, just a small investment with big payoffs throughout the rest of the season. So half hour, and there you go. They have a bit of a framework to work on, or at least they're more familiar when you first connect them to the GymAware.
And we start getting good questions from them too. It's like, okay, they start asking me, why are we measuring mean velocity versus peak velocity on this exercise, but not this exercise? And, what is, so they might open up the leaderboard and they're like, okay, why is, they'll have a bigger player. He's like, how come this little guy is doing better than this? I'm like, oh, well, it's because this is set on a absolute value. Put on a relative value, we're actually improving. So, they start asking some good questions, and they start to understand the training process. Well, how can I improve this score? And it's like, okay, we might need to look at getting a little bit leaner, or improve your strength to body weight ratio. And so it's just, they become more informed consumers. It does tie back a little bit to, they're pretty academically oriented, the athletes we work with, and they want to know the why, and just helps them buy into the overall training process.
I actually just had one quick question I forgot about. In terms of their school and study workload, do you notice any fatigue trends around that? Do you do any testing specifically when say, for example, it's a heavy study period or an exam period? You could take it into account just because that's happening, but do you specifically have a test for it, and do you notice anything?
No, I just know the end of September and the middle of October. Like, it happens all at once. It's a 1 to 2 week window that it's going to happen. So I've pretty much accepted it and understand it, and it actually does help me in terms of the feedback of data. Allow them to see the impact that fatigue has on their performance. Because you can, again, one of the reasons I use the jump monitoring, especially in the off season, is to be able to, especially football, they love vertical jump. That's a big metric they understand. And sometimes they don't see that improvement at the end of the semester, which is usually after 2 weeks of cramming for final projects. We usually have spring football camp going on, and that's a high time for party season as well too. So, they may come in, they may walk into their testing, which is right after the semester ends, and they're probably the worst they are neurologically the entire year, and they don't see their vertical go up. But at least now, with this data I've accumulated over the off season, I'm like, well, 2 weeks ago when you weren't in this state, you hit a PV, and I can show them where they started. And I'm like, oh, over here where there's a dip, that's right before reading week. When you came back from reading week, there you are. And they start to understand that. Like, it's actually been the number of messages I've even got during this COVID period from some of our athletes, like, man, like, I've hit, like, there's some of our basketball players, like, I could only do this weight for 1 rep on bench. Now I can do it for 10. I'm like, you're well rested for the first time in probably a decade. You're actually not fatigued. So remember this when we come back, and the impact that, your fitness or fatigue can have on your fitness from a fitness fatigue model perspective. So, there's that probably just, we don't have much else. This is our best tool that we have, is just subjectively how they're doing. And then, physically how they're performing when they come in, and we can just give them some recommendations based off of how they're feeling, and then auto-regulate as well too. So the auto-regulation sometimes takes care of that.
Yeah. Do you kind of think that, like, GymAware's sort of changed the intent in the change room, and because I know myself, like when I first started training VBT, like before that, I would just go into the gym and I just sort of go through the motions. But then as soon as you add that objective measure, you sort of start to, okay, I'm going to move the bar as fast as possible. Do you think the guys in lockdown, in COVID, do you think they're applying that in their own training at the moment?
Probably not. No, I think that's probably not. That's they would need something. I'm fortunate, I borrowed one from work, so I have it in the garage. I might have the best outfitted gym in the province here, in terms of being able to give myself that feedback. I'm a victim to it too. I'll do that first rep, and I'll see the score, and then I'll get motivated. I'll do my second rep, and it'll be better. So that is challenging, but we're just trying to balance that out with speed work and jump supply match, get their intent that way. So, but yeah, intent's been, just the research around intent and the differences you're going to get by giving maximal effort versus, again, one of the Spanish studies, half effort in terms of outcomes is impressive. So, and again, what's our goal maybe in season? It's retaining fast twitch fiber firing and high threshold motor units. And yes, we could do that by maximum effort strength training, but that's going to have some negative trade-offs. Or we could do some sub-maximal work and show them essentially a scoreboard of intent. And we're going to get similar adaptations with less poor trade-offs. And that's again one of the challenges of working with a team sport athlete versus a specialized weightlifter like a powerlifter. Is powerlifter understands everything behind sub-maximal effort training in terms of strength speed work and speed strength work, and they understand what they have to do and how it's beneficial. For a team sport athlete only knows weight on the bar. Yeah. If that's the only parameter they have, that's the only gauge they have to measure their improvement. Whereas if you can give them a different variable, different metric to be able to measure themselves against, then you've reframed the question a little bit, reframed the answer.
Yeah, definitely. Elliott, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your insights. I know myself and Will definitely appreciate it. Everyone listening would as well. Yeah, thanks. Will, anything else?
No, that was great. Always a pleasure to hear from a coach, and also when it comes across so simply, like I think it's complex from the outside, but when you hear someone like yourself talking, it makes sense. And it seems easy. And I think that's just magic. So thank you.
No worries. Again, appreciate it. And again, it's been a huge benefit to our athletes and our school. And if there's a way for it to positively impact others, and I hope people take advantage of it.